This weekend, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has been blocked by Labour's ruling committee from running to become an MP and presumably eventually challenge the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Now, when Andy started dipping his toe into the water and making comments suggesting he might run, one of those comments was that we were too in hock to the bond markets. And funnily enough, the bond markets didn't like that. And last week, they moved a bit at the news that he might be becoming an MP again. So to discuss that and what else is going on in the economy this week, I thought there's no better placed person to go over those topics than James Nation, the Managing Director of Forefront Advisors. He's worked for Rishi Sunak in the Treasury and also as the Deputy Head of Sunak's Policy Unit in Number 10. But more important than that, he is a friend of the show. James, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me back, Michael.
Thank you. As I said there, when the news came out at the end of last week that this seat was available and Burnham might be putting his hat in the ring, the bond markets moved a bit, the pound slumped a little bit. Are we getting too overexcited by these movements in the markets? Or are traders really alarmed at Burnham's brand of, pro-small business socialism that he might be bringing?
Quite, well, that might be one to unpack. Look, as you rightly say and suggest, Michael, there are movements throughout the day, right? There are fluctuations throughout the day, so one shouldn't get too carried away. Nonetheless, I do think what we saw on the 10-year yield last Friday was significant. It unwound later when I think rightly in the end, participants assumed that Burnham would be blocked from standing, but there was movement. And look, I had New York-based clients asking me about Gorton and Denton. You know, people remember the first time Andy Burnham said the in hoc to the bond markets comment, you know, in the run-up to Labour Party conference in a rival magazine. So these things do cut through. And I think you need to take a massive step back to understand why. And we're sort of seeing an example of this at the moment when we think what's happening in Japan, where you've got the new prime minister holding an election in February on a fiscal expansionist ticket. You know, you have investors looking at quite highly indebted developed economies now and just wondering, is there a realization among the governing classes of some of the fundamental challenges in the public finances that each nation faces? And I think Burnham's comments that he was going to be blasé about those, coupled with, I think, what would be quite an interventionist agenda, if you think of what he said on nationalisation and other areas, definitely did lead people to think, hang on a minute, are we pricing UK debt accordingly? Because surely this guy would want to reach for a bazooka of some form.
Isn't there an argument, though, that he's actually right? I mean, we are too in hoc to the bond markets, not because politicians wrongly care about them, but because, you know, they are the generous strangers that allow the state to continue being the size it is. You know, it's a feature of the system that we're in hoc to the bond markets. That's not wrong, is it?
It's not wrong to highlight the feature of the system, but for a government to function, you still need financing and you still need to have an overall plan that is respectful of that. And then you can calibrate your borrowing costs accordingly. You need to be aware of those constraints. And I think, look, there is for sure, I think, a critique, and perhaps we can get onto this, that those on the Labour side would level right now about maybe being too in hoc to marginal judgments around headroom or what the OBR decide to say. But I think if you're going out there and you are using language that might indicate that you're not aware of some very real constraints at the moment, given the UK's debt position, it risks just looking like, well, you know, at worst, do you really quite comprehend ultimately how a government can sustain itself financially?
We'll get on in a moment to what another Labour leader might mean for fiscal policy, but just sticking on the bond markets. Before last week's intervention, they had been improving this so-called moron premium, the gap between our G7 neighbours and our borrowing costs had been narrowing. And that seemed to be because expectations of inflation here were improving. And I wonder if, have people like me, have journalists been too in hoc to the bond markets? I mean, when they moved last year, we always assumed it was about the headroom, it was about the fiscal policy, but maybe it was more to do with inflation all along.
I think there's a fair comment there that definitely the UK's elevated inflationary position was a cause for concern. And look, we spoke about this, didn't we, the last time we caught up? One of the, I think, good things that the budget did do last year is there was quite a sizable package of disinflationary policies, including on the energy side. So look, I think, yes, inflation is a big part of it, but I do, and perhaps this is more just qualitative from the conversations that I have, there is still a bit of an uncertainty around, the UK, and do politicians properly get some of the fundamental trade-offs given our debt position? And that's why, again, to take it back, Michael, to the conversation we had last year, I think a lot of the issues with that budget was just how, when you took a massive step back, how credible really was it when you're looking at, quite backloaded, backdated spending cuts and tax rises later on in this parliament. So, I think part of it is inflation. Part of it is when the herd moves, there's just movement full stop. So you've always got to, I think, if we're keeping ourselves honest, if there are ever fluctuations, you've got to ask yourself, is US data out today? What is going on elsewhere in other G7 economies? But I do think there is still this sense of, have we got a political economy in the UK which is working? I think there is still that doubt. And
just before we get on to that point, do you think markets hadn't really properly priced the budget? I mean, the yields reacted well. They went down in response, essentially just to the news that the headroom had been increased from record lows to still quite low, but double what the margin had been. And they seem to not pay attention to that very important point you make, that this whole budget was spending now funded by tax rises in and around an election that seemingly aren't going to happen, and around, unsustainable plans around disability spending. Do you think markets have factored that in now if they hadn't before?
Well, it's about vantage point, Michael, and it's about, I think, a lot of these things taking time. So I think, look, if we walk it back, because we all had a bit of a grand old Duke of York experience with the last budget, didn't we? So I think from a market's perspective, I remember saying to you in the run-up, they were expecting a different budget from what fundamentally got delivered. Before we saw the wobble on the manifesto breach, really you were expecting that actually in April this year you'd see quite significant and difficult broad-based tax rises. I think for those of us who watch politics, we always were quite, are you really going to do that before locals? Come on.
Well, you were quite aggressively warning this. I mean, I think myself and my colleague James Heal were quite happy to say, surely she's going to have to raise the basic rate of income tax. You were sort of one of the rare voices saying you don't think that was going to happen.
Absolutely. I just think I just remember thinking, for a Labour government to breach a manifesto pledge on a broad-based personal tax, not to put up personal tax rates, I just thought, whoa. And clearly that's without having any sense of the numbers, which it turned out behind the scenes were better than what we all thought. But anyway, to kind of continue it through. So you had kind of markets then adjusting and thinking, okay, we're not getting this difficult front-loaded pain for political reasons. But then, as you say, on the day, they see a plan which, increases headroom quite substantially. Yeah. But I think in time, you will start to see a bit more of a realization. We'll come on to spending in a moment. Can you accept, or can you believe that a Labour government will hold departmental spending flat going into a general election? And then I think the tax wobbles and U-turns we've seen so far, I think business rates, they can kind of get away with that, as we'll just do a further temporary bit of support for pubs and hospitality.
But is that not the budget unravelling more and more?
This is the point I was going to make. I think in my mind, there is a difference between, and whether this spin works, let's see, but there is a difference between Rachel Reeves saying, I'm going to roll over some further temporary support for pubs for 1 year. I mean, that's probably going to be the new fuel duty, just kind of a news flash, versus if you actually saw some of these tax rises that are in the numbers later start to unwind. So to give you an example, if there were they're not all that significant in revenue raising terms, but I think if you were to start to see serious design issues around, the electric vehicles pay per mile charge, or the high value property or mansion tax, these are some of the new taxes that were meant to kick in later. And if you start to get indications that actually are some of those unlikely to ever really see the light of day, well, then on the tax side, people might start to think, hang on a minute, does this really stack up?
Yeah. Well, let's get into spending and the Labour leadership, because the view among my lobby colleagues seems to be increasingly that potentially after the May elections, there's going to be serious challenge to Starmer's leadership. Before he was blocked, Burnham seemed the obvious, king across the water. But Wes Streeting seems, quite a likely person as well. And if we think far out to the election, both the Green Party and Reform, I would say, whatever they say about fiscal restraint, actually have quite wide-ranging spending plans. Is any of that compatible with the debt position that we're in. You know, we started this episode talking about the bond markets. They're just not going to put up with a sort of more left-wing approach to running the Treasury, are they?
No, I think, it's incredibly hard at the moment to see how you get to this politically. But I think, Michael, we are just going to have to see a moment in this parliament where there is a significant kind of, I don't want to call it a concession to the bond markets, but there will have to be a controversial decision, I think, that recognises that in order to do what a new Labour Prime Minister, I think, will have to do politically, which is free up some more room for more departmental spending, you might need to see a tricky trade-off or lever pulled on something like fuel duty, or even, dare I say it, the pensions triple lock.
Yeah.
Again, I've seen all the polling. I know how controversial this is, but I would just note that Nigel Farage was equivocal on the future of the triple lock just a few days ago. I just wonder at some stage, is that your price? Is that something that just has to go in terms of UK policy? And fine, it may be an up to 12 billion saving, but you get a sort of credibility boost as well for doing that. The reason why I think that, Michael, is I just think you've raised some of them based on kind of where our politics is, but also all of the fiscal pressures we know about. And yes, there are some very credible cases for reform on the welfare side, reforming the welfare side, but we know about defence, we know about, departmental spending, whatever. I just think, given our debt position, there will have to be an offsetting decision forced on the political class at some stage.
When you were in government, was that ever something you were thinking about for the future, that, this fiscal reset might have to come sooner than it has done, and that you would have to do some drastic cut or some drastic tax raising measure?
Well, remember, we did do quite a few. So if we think back to, I remember Budget 21 when we were still in the throes of the pandemic. But, I think Rishi's mantra was always try and keep a dual eye on being expansionist where we need to be in terms of pandemic support, but don't save all of the kind of public finances repair job until years down the line. Yeah. So I remember that being a very hard manoeuvre, Michael, because we had to do what we did on corporation tax and then obviously thresholds, which has now become much more controversial. Yeah. I mean, look, it's the kind of thing where I'm not going to describe it as a sort of lovely problem to have, but it's the kind of thing where, you want to be confronting these choices when you've got a strong majority early doors and are able to use your capital in your first budget to make a kind of big decision. And I think, as you and I have discussed before, maybe one of the big mistakes that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have made, if you think about something like the winter fuel payment, was you exhausted all of your leverage on that for a minimal saving for an isolated payment, which has now arguably spooked you from doing anything kind of reformy in the pensioner space. So that's just one example. But I think, was it something we were alive to? Yes. But I think we were sort of at the stage of the political cycle where we felt we don't really have the mandate or the effective power to do a big repair job here. And I think, one of the sad facts for this government so far is the time where they were the strongest, I don't think you saw that effort either.
It was squandered. Yeah, and I suppose the only positive note is I wonder if public attitudes are slowly changing on this, because in my writing about the debt issue last year, I was always slightly sympathetic to politicians, and that actually it's the public that had become accustomed to this much larger state that happened because of COVID and during COVID. And there's some polling that suggests maybe that's changing now, and that actually a growing number of people would agree, I think, with you and I, that the tax and spend are a bit out of control. And maybe that will make it easier for a party to do that fiscal reset.
I think so, but again, it requires leadership. It requires good political argument. It requires the public buying that you are making a difficult trade-off decision like that because it's what the country needs rather than mopping up your own mistakes and your own errors. And I think that's where we come to, if there is a challenge against Keir Starmer this year, I think what I've just said will form part of what the case and argument against him and Rachel Reeves is, which is, there is an opportunity to have harder conversations with the public, but not if the kind of political skill isn't there to plot an effect or chart an effective argument through, or a case for why you're doing this and why you're prioritizing what you're prioritizing. I think the problem for them so far, these last 18 months and more, has been you have just seen these isolated decisions that don't have that broader explanation behind them, and then comes across to the public. The public can still say, well, hang on, maybe I do agree that actually we're spending too much as a country, but why are you doing it on the backs of, that group or this group. You need to have that wrapper and that better communication. And I think that is something that, like I'm saying, prospective leadership challenges will try and prosecute, I think.
Well, on those people within the Labour Party, Andy Burnham, Wes Streeting, and then outside the party, Zach Polanski, they don't seem to me likely to want to make that argument. They would rather say, we've the claim that we've underinvested in the NHS, that we're underinvesting in welfare, and they would want to expand those things. Do you think they're just deluded to the reality of yields and the reality of debt, or do you think that Burnham's got some cunning plan where he could somehow do both? I mean, is it dishonest that they're making these arguments? They just not understand?
I think the Green Party beyond the pale, as far as I can see, in terms of what I read around their fiscal planning. Getting back into kind of modern monetary theory, all of those. No, that is not the era that we are in. I think what I'd sort of say here, Michael, is just if I'm, and clearly I'm not, but if I was thinking of a challenge for the top job of the Labour Party, I'd learn from Andy Burnham's comments, actually. And I'd just be a bit aware that I need to define the political problem I need to solve. And then plot a course through, knowing this backdrop that we've been describing, sensitive markets, elevated debt position, in as smart a way as you possibly can. And I think we are getting signs already that maybe there are people in the Rayner and Streeting camps who get this, arguably. You've seen some, briefing to the media in recent weeks. We know we're going to have underlying fiscal credibility. I've seen Wes in recent interviews he's not quite praised the markets, but he said, my people, he's let it be known that his people are reaching out to markets people or whatever. I think what you might see is something like this. I think if there is a leadership contest, I reckon whoever stands is actually, we'll stick to Rachel's fiscal rules. Doesn't really want fiscal to be a big talking point in the contest. Maybe focuses on Europe and other things, and I'll just do a better job of communicating. But then actually thinks, what's the political problem that we need to solve? And maybe the political problem that we need to solve for the Labour Party is that currently Rachel Reeves's plans mean that unprotected departments are going to face big cuts, and we can't afford to have those cuts. So we need to try and have enough credibility to get through to a budget in the autumn, let's say, or ahead of the spending review next year, where we can do enough to find I think the Resolution Foundation have it down as 6 billion or whatever to avoid those cuts to unprotected departments. We just need to craft an event where we can find some flexibility or other ways to plug that gap. Do you see what I mean? And I think that is then, if you're being shrewd about it, that is the political problem that they've got to address. They cannot have a return to austerity as something that the Labour Party perceive is happening. But to do that, they're going to have to learn from Andy Burnham and be much smarter and cuter in how they play it in the coming period.
We're sticking on Burnham because there does seem to be some suggestion that it's potentially not over yet. I mean, we're recording this on Monday, and the Attorney General is going to be speaking to the PLP to make the case why they shouldn't, uprise in outrage at his blocking. But when he was criticised for his bond market comments, and on that competency point, his defence, he turns around and says, look at Manchester. It's one of the only non-London parts of the UK where you're seeing this productivity growth, where it could be an example of how a Labour government actually brings about growth. But can we trust the figures that he cites?
I know this amused me yesterday, Mark, because I saw a headline. I think it was a byline that said something like, Andy Burnham likes the Smiths and Everton, but can he be leader of a Labour Party? And I kind of wonder there's a similar one here, look at what he's done in Manchester, but can he be leader of a Labour Party? Pointing to Manchester as this big success story. Look, I think, you and I have read the same blog where there are some reasons, at least to doubt some of the underlying data in Manchester. Very strong productivity stats, but actually, someone has gone under the bonnet to try and establish, well, is that just down to one particular subset of service industries in one particular Manchester geography or whatever? But I think regardless of that, look, you go to Manchester, certainly when I go to Manchester, it does feel like there's a buzz there. It does feel like he's got a good local dialogue with business leaders. It does feel that he has been able to use the powers that he has around public transport effectively, albeit there is still an effective Westminster backstop there in terms of cash. But I think, can you elevate and scale all of that up to a national level? I mean, when he talks about nationalisation, that would involve some quite staggering numbers coming onto the government's balance sheet. So look, it's been an effective partnership that I think he's been able to run, because that's the mayoral model. He is undeniably a big electoral asset in Manchester, and he's worked well effectively with local leaders. But if he's advocating still for, some quite big fiscal expansionary stuff, he would face trade-offs in national government that you don't in the mayoralty.
Yeah. I want to widen our conversation out now to sort of some wider economic issues. And we're obviously talking a lot about Labour, but I'm going to turn my guns on you for a moment.
Yes.
Which is something I've mentioned on Reality Check, and something I've written about is how bad our debt interest payments are. And yesterday it was confirmed that last year was the second worst calendar year on record for the amount we're paying, not on the debt, but the interest that debt is generating. And part of that is because of these things called linkers. So gilts that are an inflation hedge, they rise with inflation. And that was kind of fine when inflation wasn't a thing, but it obviously came back. And one of the reasons why they've affected Britain so much is because something like 25% of the gilts that we've issued are these linkers. When you were advising Rishi Sunak in the Treasury and in Number 10, we kept issuing this inflation-linked debt. Were you part of the problem?
I was probably part of many problems, Michael. But I think on this one, I would honestly say, not to excuse it, but more just to explain it, you don't tend to get involved as a Treasury political team with issuance or tenor.
Sure. It's left to the debt management.
It is left to the DMO. And, I don't want to stray so far out of my lane to say that, that maybe there was some form of rationale in the mix of what was being issued at the time where that made sense. What I will say is, knowing that, 25%, the figure that you cite, that linkers were a big part of what we had to finance ourselves. That is honestly why I recall Rishi being quite alert to the inflation issue before anyone else at the time, because I remember hearing him saying, this is not just a cost of living issue that we're going to see as a result of, this was even before Russia and Ukraine, right? This was his concern around what you would see with the unwinding of the pandemic, given what had happened to supply chains. His point was, well, there's not just an issue in terms of cost of living, there's this issue as well because of what it would ultimately mean for the government finances. Yeah. And yet you can find you get a positive side on the receipts front, again, as we saw from the OBR forecast last year. But, there is an issue in terms of what that then means for government borrowing costs. But look, maybe ministers should be taking more of an overview of what the DMO do or asking questions. All I can say to you is I don't recall us ever really getting involved in that. I think in fairness, partly because we also had to. There was also
you're in the aftermath of the Trust mini budget. So do you think the Sunak ministry sort of deserves a bit more credit for how important driving down inflation was then?
Yes, I think in the sense that I do think Rishi deserves more credit for identifying it early, and I think when people go back to that 2022 race, which. Gosh, it feels like an inordinate amount of time ago.
I can imagine.
I straight away,
a lot's changed
I just go to I was having hula hoops for breakfast, but over the campaign. But no, but I think in all seriousness, when people go back to that time, the thing that I remember is just how, again, even before the leadership race with Liz Truss, when he was still Chancellor, banging on about inflation before others were. And then I think he did call correctly in those hustings over the summer what would happen as a kind of knock-on if, we saw the market reaction that we did, and that we still had that persistent high inflation that we needed to prioritise before you could get to choices around tax cuts, which obviously the Tory party was desperate for, but you did have that elevated inflation scenario. So yes, look, I do think there'll be countless things, and I'm sure some books this year on the Sunak premiership and before, but I do think he was right on the inflation question.
Sure.
He was.
Another big part of all our lives is the Office for Budget Responsibility. We're never not thinking about it. And there was an article in the Sunday Times this weekend where they ranked 26 major economic forecasters. And they gave the OBR 1 out of 10 for its predictive record, which was joint last in their table. There's people on the left that have criticised the OBR saying it has too much power, get rid of it. Nigel Farage recently has said it's another unaccountable quango that we need to get rid of. this Sunday Times story proves that, doesn't it? We should just bin the OBR.
No, I think we should look at ways of continually improving their forecasts. And I think we should dive into that in a moment. But I don't think the answer is to get rid of a independent forecaster. It's to make that forecaster better.
But why are they getting stuff so wrong then? I mean, they should have the power of the Treasury's insight. They've got some leading economic minds in there.
Well, look, so here's a couple of points I'd make. I think undeniably their transparency needs to improve on the economy side of the forecast. And remember, I think if I'm right, in that league table, it was October 24.
Yeah.
So it's before they have made, in fairness, an adjustment on the productivity side, knowing that they were so optimistic. Then the Treasury interaction, remember, that cuts both ways. So they have a hard job because they are, yes, an independent forecaster, but they have that interaction with the Treasury. So I am not saying that Rachel Reeves and her team will have lent on the OBR to say, oh, actually, don't make the impact of employer NICs all that bad in your numbers. But I'm just saying they are quite cautious because they don't like to be so out there initially on government policy changes. And I think that explains why maybe on unemployment and other factors they were off as well. I think in fairness, they did slightly better on outturn borrowing, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So I remember looking at it and thinking, actually, I think possibly the 1 out of 10 is too harsh. But my point is, October 24, first budget of a new government. Yes, the Chancellor reaches for a big tax lever. They probably were too cautious at that point around what they thought some of the knock-on impacts of that employer NICs rise was. That said, Michael, I don't go from all of that to say the answer is get rid of them, bring the forecast back in-house in the Treasury. I think, are they resourced properly? Are they transparent enough? Are there some innovations at the margins around having broader peer review and a broader panel of forecasters? Maybe. But I think, for me, the wrong answer is for more political oversight and influence here.
If we move then onto your own forecasts, because last year as an economics editor, it was a great time to be writing about economics because just every day there seemed to be a relentless stream of bad news stories, which people want to read. So it was good for me. But I'm a bit worried this year because Morgan McSweeney has pushed this messaging through Keir and Rachel that actually the economy is going to turn the corner. They say that inflation is coming down. It's going to potentially come down to target this year. There was some better than expected growth figures, and also markets seem to be pricing in that there'll be 1.5, if not 2 cuts to the bank's base rate. So am I right to be worried? Is this going to be the year that Britain's economy turns the corner?
I think, look, from my perspective, maybe it's a slightly different story for inflation than it is for growth. I think it can only be a good thing if we are seeing inflation move back down towards target, right? And I think, like I said, I'm very critical of government policy on many things, but I think that the one thing the budget did do, regardless of the credibility in future years or lack of, was it did get the Bank of England and the Treasury back in sync and with some good kind of disinflationary measures to boot as well. So maybe, obviously we saw the uptick in the recent print, but maybe we are looking at a more benign environment on inflation. On growth, just from the economists I speak to, I think it's unclear, Michael. I wonder, you always wonder, are you getting a bit of a New Year bounce?
Yeah.
It's
we got such seasonality in the GDP figures as well, right? It's just so hard to tell.
So it's really hard to tell now. And you've got other hard factors as well, as which is I think we've seen, consumer confidence surveys really low for years now, but then people are searching for some relativity in the data that might be better. And then, there are some PMI stats recently that I think have been a bit more positive. But I don't think we know. I think that's it. I don't think we know. One thing I will say is I think we do potentially confront a 2026 where maybe economy and fiscal is a bit more, or maybe a bit more boring than last year. Notwithstanding what I was just saying about, a potential budget in the autumn with a new top team if they do get rid of Keir Starmer. But then you've got the political situation, which is far from boring. Yeah.
Well, we'll be trying our best on Reality Check to keep the economy interesting. But before we let you go, James, whenever you come on the Spectator podcast and whenever we talk to you, we always pester you, as I've done today, about your time in government. But you're outside of government now, running an advisory firm. And I wonder if you have any reflections on what it's like being in the private sector now compared to advising from the inside, and whether there's anything that the people that are doing the job, albeit for Labour now, that you were doing for the Conservatives could learn from that.
Oh, a couple of things, Michael. One, you just need to have more conversations with people on the outside when you're in there. I mean, every day I learn so much from, our clients and my clients. And there are conversations I have now that I wish I'd had when I was a government advisor. And you feel so time poor that the stakeholder engagement is always what you sort of push away, or you let the civil service control. But definitely when I was working in the Treasury, I just wish I'd picked up the phone more. And then now I would just say the second point, Michael, is when you're on the outside, always have the humility to realize that you are not in the room. And that if you were in the room, these people, advisors around senior politicians, are not idiots. They have serious pedigree to be in the jobs and positions that they are. And so I always try and ask myself, when a mistake is made, even the winter fuel payment thing I was discussing earlier, can I understand why that happened and how you get into that position? So rather than being like, oh, they don't know what they're doing, it's more, no, it is such a hard environment where you get about 30, 40 decisions across your desk each day. There's no easy choice. There's trade-offs. Try and understand, well, how have they got themselves into that particular hole? And then try and think, well, what might they do to get out of it? And know that you are never going to be privy to the full information, because when you're on the outside, you never quite know exactly what's happening behind closed doors.
James Nation, thank you very much for joining Reality
Thanks for having me.